Last week, almost exactly at this moment, as you and I were going live, David, the story was breaking about this mass grave that was discovered with the bodies of 215 Indigenous children at this residential school in Canada. How are you today, David?
I'm very well, and I must say I'm still shaken by that news, but it was inevitable it would come out, and there's a story attached that goes back to the Second World War. But over to you.
Well, and that's part of the reason it caught my attention is that it struck me as something that you have raised in the past. We did an entire episode about these residential schools. I didn't know anything about it. I have a feeling a lot of people in Canada didn't know a lot about it, but it is tied to Trudeau's in some way, isn't it?
Well, absolutely, and as usual, you've done this marvelous collage that is enigmatic and communicative. I think because the characters that are displayed are really extraordinary. But I would describe at least two of them, and possibly a third, as practitioners of the art of pimping.
Yeah.
And the art of pimping, I think, involves you're selling something. What it turns out after all my research is these people, I think, are pimping the BBC's parallel narratives, right? I mean, you can pimp anything, right? You can pimp a child, you can pimp an adult. Generally, it's the connotation is involved in some sexual experience. But of course, is that the right word? The BBC is infested with the most bizarre kinds of sexual experience or sexual practitioners, including the guy who's up on the wall of your collage with the cigar, whose name is Jimmy Savile,
Well,
probably the
let's,
most.
David, for a moment, let's just make sure everybody knows who we've got depicted here, because I don't think everybody is up to speed. Give us a little background here.
Okay, so Jimmy Savile died in 2010, and he worked for about 50 years with the BBC. And I believe he was a pimp for an extraordinary network run by the BBC without the knowledge of everyone in the BBC, but certainly senior people, director generals, and a few levels down,
Well, let me pause you
because this.
there, because you are hitting on one of the core topics, not known by everybody. In fact, I think it would be known by only a very small number of people in the BBC. Isn't this the very essence of how a clandestine operation can survive? Everybody always says, well, that must be a conspiracy theory because how could they do that? Somebody would blow the whistle.
Yeah, and that's involves compartmentalization and making people. I think they call it in espionage rubber hose proof. That is, you can't beat the truth out of them
Right.
because they don't know the truth. They know a little bit, right? That would be enough perhaps to get them past a couple of interviews with the Gestapo or in room 101, which was actually inside this building. And that's the torture room mentioned by George Orwell in his 1984 book, right?
But the
But if
goal
you
of
could,
that compartmentalization is to protect the operation because no individual in the field would have a sufficient level of knowledge to be able to expose it. They just don't even know themselves.
yes, they play a role. You heard this term live action role play. So they call in crisis actors for these, what Serco calls, what is it? Not reinforcement. What is that? Anyway, there's a Serco
Resilience.
word, resilience training, where Serco, a British company, actually borrows government networks like the BBC and stages a virtual event to test the ability of spokespersons acting for the government to act calmly and resolutely through a crisis, whether the crisis is manufactured digitally or triggered physically, like COVID, right? So, for example, the BBC put on that show Contagion in 2018 that simulated the spread of a virus. And it was a very compelling show, but it was a parallel narrative, of course. And essentially, what the parallel narrative did, and this is a term I pick up as I go along. I think it was introduced to me by John Cullen, this idea of anchoring bias, right? So there you have Dr. Hannah Fry, who becomes the lead player or host of this show called Contagion exclamation mark, where what the BBC had done, it commissioned an app called the Pandemic app to be downloaded on volunteers' mobiles. And the app was programmed with artificial intelligence algorithms to be infected digitally if one party with a mobile got within, let's say, 6 feet of another party with a mobile for longer than a minute. And so this became an extraordinarily persuasive, at first blush, analog or metaphor for how a real virus might spread through the community. But of course, it's not a real virus. The digital virus is transmitted with a signal coming from one mobile to another. A physical virus is transmitted or transported by, let's say, an asymptomatic carrier, right, who might actually infect someone else through physical contact.
But David, isn't this a hypothetical test that could be used in some sort of, gold standard resilience training, a combined resilience training exercise that tests the network, it tests the public, it tests the newsreaders themselves? This is basically what they're describing in this document.
Absolutely. And Serco grew out of a management buyout and IPO of RCAGB 1929, Radio Corporation of America, Great Britain 1929, which got a contract for telling the British public, or giving 4 minutes warning to the British public of an attack by an intercontinental ballistic missile. So, of course, it worked very closely with the BBC during World War II. That's RCA with the BBC. So I think, is it worth just mentioning how that double cross operation with the transmitters?
Absolutely, because double cross, it seems to be, David, it's a tactic that's being used all the time. Someone is presented as an honest, helpful ally, only later to be revealed as an infiltrator. And we've spoken about this document many times before, but I think it's important to come back to it because people really need to focus on the language for a moment. The simulation and the media support aspect of this talk about a method of delivering an exercise that's flexible and is designed with the client to meet their requirements, with specific options ranging from something very simple, paper-based delivery, all the way on up to the full use of real communication systems, advanced computer simulation. We don't know really what that means. A media play can also be added in the form of news injects, David. Someone is injecting news.
Well, absolutely. So let's go back to, let's just stay with Operation Mincemeat very quickly. So the BBC and Radio Corporation of America, GB 1929, put together a deception, a brilliant deception, one of the most successful in World War II, where the Germans were persuaded that the invasion in the soft underbelly of Europe would take place through Greece and not through Sicily. So the Germans moved 3 divisions, I think that's 30,000 men, don't quote me on my knowledge of military organizations, but I believe they moved 30,000 men to Greece, and this is very important, they kept them throughout the war because Hitler and the chain of command had been persuaded by the BBC that the attack on Sicily was a feint. And even bigger, this is so vitally important because I don't know what American military strategists are teaching their interns or their young people, but they don't seem to be learning about the art of war, where Sun Tzu said, all war is deception, right? So in the case of Operation Bodyguard, and just incidentally, I believe Churchill called it bodyguard because he said the truth is so important, it has to be accompanied by a bodyguard of lies. Well, that's interesting for your show, which is Crowdsource the Truth, right? So I believe your show and my show and our shows are being accompanied by a bodyguard of lies imputed by the other side. Right?
Why would they give us a bodyguard? I agree that there's lies that they're putting out there, but it doesn't seem to be intended to guard us in any way.
It's their bodyguard. You see what I'm saying? So their parallel narratives need a bodyguard in order to maintain the deception. And let me just quickly race through. So where you have a major incident with mass casualties and the crime is associated with the other side, let's say, the most important part of persuasion is after the bodies have been, well, the living people have died, what do you do with the evidence? Now, what they can do, and that's basically embedded in the title, is the BBC that is, I believe, promoting or injecting, right, the parallel narrative, has to maintain pimps, if you will, in various high-profile locations like, say, New York and London and Vancouver, to maintain the lie, that is, or protect the lie, and make sure that all of the body bits that would have evidence of how people died have been taken away, where possible, destroyed or incinerated, and where it's unavoidable, buried in a mass grave. And what's extraordinary is you have, I believe, a mass grave of Fire Department of New York body bits at the Fresh Kills landfill, right? There's a mass grave.
But wait a minute, David, before we go to that, because we do want to cover that, I just want to make sure that we've, covered for everybody who these various pimps are, because I think there are some people might not understand what we mean by pimps, and then we'll come to the Fresh Kills. But who else have we got here, David?
All right, so over on the right, you have Gilan Maxwell, right? Now, she was a pimp working with Jeffrey Epstein. She came to New York, I believe, around the 1990-91 period with a sinecure, if that's the right term, of about $50,000 a year from her father's estate. Incidentally, her father had been found floating off the back of, I think they called it the Lady Gislin, which was his private yacht. He was probably murdered, but he had been ransacking the Daily Mirror pension fund. So he was a crook. He was also a very capable spy. I believe he's been buried with full military honors in Israel, but it's very difficult to determine whether he was spying for the British or spying for the Israelis or spying for the Americans. Who knows?
But he also was doing stuff in Bulgaria. This guy was double-crossing all the way. And, I mean, was there any link? I mean, I know he was a media mogul, but was there any BBC link to Robert Maxwell?
Well, you've just got it. You see, because now you see just at the top left, that presumably is a documentary by the BBC, which I can guarantee you will be a parallel narrative. It'll convey to the BBC's listeners what the BBC wants you to believe about Robert Maxwell, and it will deprive the listeners of access to the real information about who he was really working for, right? So this is a classic example. And incidentally, this year, the BBC is coming out with 911, the 20th anniversary.
Right.
And that will be a parallel. In fact, they use that term to describe the genesis of that documentary, right?
Right.
It will be put out by BBC Studios. And what it will give you is probably the word tragedy will occur about 100 times in that documentary, when really what they should be talking about is it's a crime scene. All of these are crime scenes. The burial of the children, the 215 children in the mass unmarked grave up at the Kamloops institution, school, it's a crime scene. And there will be body bits of young girls or young boys who will show that they were raped and tortured sexually. I can't guarantee it, but there should be a yellow tape around these crime scenes, right? And no one should go in or out without proper authority to do what I understand is the proper procedure at the crime scene. You identify where you picked something up, you pop it in a paper bag or a plastic bag, and you initial if you're the custodian of that. And there has to be a chain of custody all the way through to the coroner's office to make sure that when a forensic analysis is done, they can prove that it hasn't been contaminated by people arriving at the crime scene and planting evidence, right? And this is the essence of in your title, where we talk about the Maximus Maxar graves. With Maximus, this is a company that's actually registered in the United States that is able to deploy people in a family at a crime scene before the crime occurs, right? Where they can take evidence away, and basically the narrative can be pimped by someone like Gilan Maxwell in New York and maintained by various other techniques. For example, Mark Thompson, the CEO or former CEO of the New York Times, who used to work, well, he was the Director General of the BBC, right? He had a long career in the BBC. I think he's got a first-class degree in English literature from Merton College, Oxford. So he's a bright guy, right? But he would be very familiar with the construction of a narrative for a double cross operation by the BBC. Right?
I think he's made the New York Times into essentially exactly the same thing. Because this article, I think this came out, well, it was updated just a few days ago, but it's talking about how they had, forcibly put these indigenous children into these schools to, I guess, indoctrinate them and kind of ingratiate them into Canadian society. When you told me about this, you said this is one of the greatest shames in Canadian history, and it seems to have gotten much worse.
And it continues to be ignored by apathetic Canadians.
Wow.
I live in this country and I love it, you see, and I think I talked to now a number of people. There are actually two crimes, as I understand it. There's a crime of commission and there's a crime of omission. I cannot understand how my fellow Canadians can sit back, with all of the comforts of their life, right, and ignore the fate of these children.
David, isn't this another one of these things, kind of like the BBC, where it is very difficult to imagine? I mean, if you're running a school, you need a lot of people in there. And I think most people who want to become a teacher or do something having to do with school, most people, I think, maybe I'm wrong, but this is my impression, most people do that because they feel like it's going to help people, going to help children learn things and help build society and be kind of like a positive thing they can do with their own life. And also it's kind of gratifying, I would think, to teach people things and have them become smarter and grow up and go and do whatever. But obviously there must be some people in this school who knew that they were burying 215 dead kids there. I don't think everybody would have known, but it's another compartmentalized, clandestine operation, isn't it?
Absolutely. And that extends through to the RCMP, who, in words of some of the victims, the survivors, the RCMP herded, when one child escaped, the RCMP would be sent to catch them and return them. Now, here's what I'm saying. This is and the RCMP would say, well, we didn't know what was going on inside. But as you point out, some RCMP would have known, just like some RCMP would have known what they were taking away in that raid on Starnet, right? In 1999.
So you mean they just call and say, hey, some student has run away. Go catch him. And the cops bring him back to school.
And go to this village, and there are 5 or 6 children that need to be picked up and brought to the school to be indoctrinated, that's your word, and taught English. They were actually caned or punished if they spoke their native language, etc., etc.
Wow.
Absolutely terrifying. Basically, I believe, and this would be an allegation, that I believe a number of these institutions were operating as pedophile brothels. That is to say, someone with money or influence would check into a motel or a hotel in the vicinity of the school and say that they wanted access to an 8-year-old girl or an 8-year-old boy. The child would be delivered to the motel or the hotel. The infliction of great torture and cruelty by the John, if that's the right word, would be inflicted on the child. And then the organization would take care of the disposal of the body. So I'm saying the most important crime scene to be investigated, including in the 9/11 attack or the COVID, the spread of the COVID around the world, right, is the place where what remains of the victim are buried, and particularly in a mass grave. Because there you only have a mass grave, I think, when there's evil afoot, right? Because most individuals that die singly, now where did you get that? Wow.
Someone in the chat, David, was telling me that there's a series of paintings of Mounties stealing the children.
Oh, God.
And
I hadn't seen that.
Here it is. Look, and here's a dark-skinned child who might be kind of an indigenous. I mean, these are paintings, obviously, not photographs. So I think we need to consider that when we watch them or look at them. But there's a lot of evidence to indicate that a lot of bad stuff went on. I don't know what that's a painting of, but there appear to be paintings of Mounties apprehending children.
Thank the listener who sent that in. That's very powerful. That's a bit shaking.
there's so many things coming to light now, David, between the discovery of this mass grave of 215 indigenous children, these emails from Anthony Fauci that seem to indicate that he not only knew that there was something more to this coronavirus outbreak, but he might well have been involved in it. It's a bit troubling to say, David, that it's not a surprise to you and I and many of our viewers that these types of atrocities are happening, and that in many cases they're being facilitated by people at the highest levels of the government and, haught society. They're the ones doing it. But it seems, David, like there might be kind of a mass cognitive dissonance happening at this moment, because people are realizing that some of these things must be true.
Yeah, so let's get back to your collage. So we covered Gilan Maxwell, right? So she was in the high society in New York, if that's
right.
Appropriate. She became a great friend of Epstein's network, but she was a pimp. So I imagine that she got a shopping list through Epstein of what powerful, potential, and influential people might require in terms of a sexual partner or an encounter with a child. And she took care of business. She actually learned how to fly helicopters. And as far as I know, she was delivering children out to Epstein's island to service the people brought on the Epstein plane.
She was also a submarine pilot, David. She's operating all these unusual vehicles. It's kind of hard to track submarines and helicopters. If you turn off the transponder, helicopter can fly all over the place.
Right. Now let's assume that she provided a total service, which is not only to procure the child to be available as a sexual partner to someone like Bill Clinton or Hillary Clinton on the island, but maybe she took care of the disposal. If she's into transport and supply chains, you've got maybe the remains of a dead child that where the evidence shows they were tortured to death on the island. Well, now you've got to get rid of it. Well, I suppose there might be a burial pit on the island, and I think basically the FBI or whatever, they should go out to that island and check it out, except that maybe the FBI is compromised. Or maybe, the body bits would go on a helicopter and she'd take it somewhere else for disposal by a team that is capable of extorting silence from witnesses. And there I come back to Maximus. Right?
But wait,
because Maximus,
don't forget, David, that Epstein and Nygaard were both flying Boeing 727s, really unusual 50-year-old jets, but they have the unique feature of this rear door that can be opened in flight conveniently to chuck out dead bodies.
Yeah, over the jungle, where crocodile infested
the ocean,
swamps, etc., etc. So, and I've been in a few close, well, anyway, that's kind of irrelevant. But the fact remains is there needs to be almost a more sophisticated operation to get rid of the evidence and develop and sustain a parallel narrative than there is in to procure the victim in the first place and set up an operation with an opportunity for, let's say, generating hardcore adult and child pornography. So let's go.
Let me pause you there for a second, because that's a strong idea you just brought up. The amount of energy put into the parallel narrative. Now, we saw that document, which, again, I think that the repetition, this is a Shakespearean tactic, David. It's important that we talk about this, because this Serco document is basically describing how parallel narratives are constructed, how social engineers get involved in media plays that involve news injects from experienced professional journalists and television crews. They are talking about how fake news is made. And fake news, as we've discussed previously, becomes fake history. So if people in Canada have been forced or caused to believe that these schools are somehow a good thing, giving education to poor kids, they're being tricked because they were actually killing them and burying them in mass graves.
Or when, and it was really interesting because when that story came out on last Friday's show in the morning, I checked during the day and it reached 3.5 million hits around the world from all different sources of media, except one. which was the BBC. Now, experienced journalists might say, well, how come the BBC didn't run the story? And I think it was because the BBC was having a parallel narrative associated with the residential schools, and they were taken by surprise, and they didn't get what they would normally have, which is the opportunity for an anchoring bias to be set up.
Right.
So the BBC came out on the next day, right? And if you look at it, it's really interesting because it says Canada mourns as remains of 215 children. Now, they could have had the title, the Kamloops school becomes a crime scene. This would be a perfect
or Canadians shocked.
Yes, so it's all shock, horror, tragedy, etc. And then Justin Trudeau pops into this BBC article, right? And so this was a painful reminder of a shameful chapter of our country's history. Well, for me, that's garbage. Prime Minister, he should be drummed out of town because this is an example of a crime scene that has not been properly investigated, right? And has probably been protected by, for example, the RCMP. Because if they were herding children into the school back in the town in the vicinity of Kamloops, there would be discussions going back several generations of maybe a motel that could provide a child on demand to a wealthy visitor in return for a payment, maybe to a charity or to the Liberal Party of Canada. So this is what is intriguing. I think this episode, the discovery of the grave, obviously there's been rumors going back years. They do a test, they announce the story, and the BBC is a day late in picking up on a parallel narrative that has been buried for decades. Right? And I think this is a classic example. What is it? The clue, the dog didn't bark. The BBC dog did not bark on the day of the announcement. It barked a day late. Now, what's the significance of that? It's because the BBC has known this for decades, and this would be an example for it. I think it's very similar to, the D-Day landing when they had those inflated tanks that fooled the Germans into thinking there was an attack going to be in the Pas-de-Calais, right? They kept, in that case, and this is why it's so important strategically to understand deception, they kept 25 divisions, 250,000 men, highly trained, well-equipped in the Pas-de-Calais when the Allies hit the Normandy beaches.
Right? Well, I have to tell you, David, that next to a foam 10-gallon hat, I really do enjoy inflatable military tanks. It's expensive, but I would like one.
Well, yes, I do. It's a classic thing of the bloody Brits, this art of deception that goes back 500 years, in my opinion. But anyway, I digress. So what we've got around the world, developed in British Columbia, are networks, communications networks that have been hacked, right? This is very important. So two companies, McDonnell Detweiler, MDA as it's known, that got absorbed into Maxar, right, developed the world's biggest satellite signal data processing capability in Canada. And what I can tell Americans is this facility was very active on 911 because there would have been satellites above New York watching every move, basically having battlefield control, not for Americans, but probably for elites in the in Canada and its allies in China, et cetera, et cetera. They would have been watching blow by blow as that sequential move attack on the United States moved ahead. So, you have a bomb that something hits the north face of the North Tower, then 16 minutes later, the south face of the South Tower, and then you have the Pentagon's US Navy Command Center, and then you have the fourth plane that crashes in the field outside Shanksville, Pennsylvania. I believe that was following a BBC narrative, a script that had been pre-written, right? And in parallel with that, the BBC was producing a documentary elements of which will be cobbled together and released this year in the 911, the 20th anniversary. But the BBC will offer the public a parallel narrative that takes it away from the burial site at the Freshkills landfill, right? Because at the Freshkills landfill, there will be the remains of firefighters who died in those buildings, and the small bits were basically processed and thrown into Garbage Hills 1 and 9. And what I say, and I'm not a forensic, whatever it is, I would say the enamel on the teeth of the firefighters will show the chemical signature of the use of thermite in those two towers.
Why the teeth?
Right? Because that's where the chemical signature would be preserved. Even if in a high temperature incendiary device, if you're not actually within the vicinity of the thermite, the center of it, which is 5,600 degrees, which would turn everything into a plasma. But as you get towards the outside of the building, there will be firefighters who were trapped, who were not consumed or crushed at 5,600 degrees Fahrenheit. That is to say, there will be bits of their bodies, right, that were processed out at the Freshkills landfill, I believe by Maximus agents, and the smaller bits were buried at the Freshkills landfill, and then the local city mayor or whatever it was, they would have been told, keep your mouth shut, let's turn this into a park, right? Well, and these people at that level, I believe they can be blackmailed or extorted into keeping their mouth shut, because at Garbage Hills 1 and 9, there will be evidence of what kind of devices we used to bring those towers down. So it's a crime scene, surveilled every day or maybe continuously by Maxar satellites. And the Maxar satellites, right, are used to maintain control over what's going on at the end of the crime scene. There's a narrative that takes the body bits right through to the mass grave or the burial pit. And if people can get inside those burial pits, they could do reverse crime scene investigation and find out the cause of death. They don't want us to find that.
And David, there's something quite interesting that you've caused me to think about that perhaps is a bit esoteric, but I'm going to bring this together for you quite quickly, because we're talking about the bodies of children being found. And, you know, I'm always very interested in the ways that the different research of various crowdsourced the truth guests intersect. And I don't know if you're aware of this, but a guy by the name of Manny Grossberg has been doing his own crowdsourced investigation into the Son of Sam murders. And this is something that you and I haven't spoken about very much, but it is similar to some of the things that we have spoken about in terms of this. You know, it's characterized by just really unusual cruelty. And obviously, you know, murder is not something that I would ever sanction, but I think there's a difference between somebody, you know, robbing a bank and shooting somebody and they die versus like what's been done to John Bonet or these children. Like torture is something very specific. So this story here has to do with the body of a girl that was found on Staten Island in 1987, and her last name is Schweiger, which it struck me, David, does that remind you of anything that we've heard of before? Seems like a German name that maybe a lot of people came over to the United States and they changed their last names. So who knows what happened? But Schweiger is a German surname derived from the verb schweigen, to be silent. And it originated as a nickname given to a silent, quiet, or taciturn person. Modern variants include the surname Schwager, Schwager, Schweigert, and Schweigerd, and probably other iterations that are similar, but it means to be silent, to keep someone silent, to engage in silencing something. What do you think about that, David?
Well, that's basically a classical insert or inject into, I think, these double-cross stories or parallel narratives. That is to say, you need compartments that are compromised, if that's the right word, where people are taught or extorted into silence or consent into something going on. And now you have the compromised nodes. So maybe we could just flip back. That's an interesting sort of coordination there, Jason. Let's flip back to the master collage and talk a little more about Christopher Charles Ingveldsson.
Yes, we have to continue introducing our audience to the various pimps.
Right, yeah. Now, this is a classic guy. So Christopher Charles Ingveldsson, and I talk slowly, it's so important. He became the roommate of Justin Trudeau, the present Prime Minister of Canada, around the 1996-97 period, when Trudeau had come to BC. I think he was a ski bum, a ski instructor or whatever. I think he enrolled in UBC at 1998. But anyway, they became roommates. Now, Christopher Charles Ingveldsson was a roommate of Justin Trudeau from 1997 to 2001. And it appears he was running an international pedophile ring at the same time as Starnet Communications was providing a hardcore adult and child pornography service into 60 countries. So if you've got one party running an international pedophile ring and another party running an international hardcore adult and child pornography generating with studios down in the basement of the building, they have to be working together, or at least the RCMP and the Vancouver police have to be aware that you've got these two operations, but they choose to do nothing about it. Now, Christopher Charles Ingveldsson eventually was arrested in 2010, Jason. That's, I believe, the year around Jimmy Savile's death. And he was given a 4-year sentence. And now he's out. Why wouldn't I assume that Christopher Charles Ingveldsson and Justin Trudeau are pimping hardcore adult and child pornography into various target countries in order to extort the silence or consent of its leaders to whatever the agenda is for the people who are spreading the theory of COVID-19 through the BBC? Because the BBC every day produces an up-to-date set of data, right, that is coming from Johns Hopkins University and Maxar Technologies. I think I sent you a link a little earlier on, through Skype to what Maxar provides in the way of servicing the people trying to respond to the COVID-19. That particular link is, you see, it's rather difficult to see. You can see Digital Globe, right? But this talks about the origin of Al-Qaeda. So Digital Globe had the technology, it would appear, to track the movements of the people who would one day form Al-Qaeda. And then fast forward to 9/11, at 9 o'clock, 2 minutes before the second plane hit the south face of the South Tower, the former Supreme Commander Allied in Europe, SACEUR, Supreme Allied Commander Europe, General Alexander Haig, the camera was pointing at the north face of the North Tower. It showed that compelling gash. And he was asked, who does he think behind it? He said, well, I don't want to speculate. I don't have the information, but we know where to look. It's either the Palestinians or Bin Laden group. Now, here's this image. And I think this is a Maxar image for the BBC that shows the disposition of what has been described as some of the sources of COVID-19. You've got the Huanan seafood market over there on the left, right? You've got the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which is very close, right? Yeah. And the theory released by the BBC, backed by the BBC, supported by the New York Times, Mark Thompson, as I understand it, is the virus jumped out of an animal at the Huanan seafood market and spontaneously infected the population and shut down Wuhan city. Now, slowly, they're developing theory it might have been produced in the Wuhan Institute of Virology, funded under gain of research with the help of Fauci.
Right, and also this British guy, Peter Daszak. So what's the relationship between him and the BBC, or is there any? This is from the 9th of February of which year. WHO says it's extremely unlikely that the virus leaked from a lab in China. And I think there he is, Peter Daszak. Focus needs to shift to those supply chains in the seafood market. So, you get some fancy idiot who's part of the World Health Organization to publish an interview in some fancy idiotic publication like the BBC, and suddenly this is gospel. If you and I say, well, it seems very likely based on what Dr. Judy Mikovits says and the research that John Cullen has done, seems very likely that this could be due to gain-of-function research not only in the lab in Wuhan, China, but also in projects having to do with the resurrection and gain-of-function of H1N1, and the 1918 Spanish flu. But David, they use experienced journalists and news injects to declare us conspiracy theorists, when in fact, we are the only ones engaged. Not the only ones, but we are among those engaged in the scientific process of exhausting every possibility, no matter how improbable, until all of the evidence is accounted for. Anyone who would just, shun a hypothesis without accurately detailing how it could not be possible is doing a disservice to science, a disservice to the truth, and a disservice to the public.
And the victims. And so now, again, as I said a little earlier, it actually requires far more resources and facilities and technology to maintain the outcome of crime scene investigations down a blind alley, right? So gradually they're backing off from the possibility that it didn't come out of that Wuhan lab, and they're avoiding at all costs the possibility that it came from the Winnipeg lab in Canada. But all of the evidence suggests it came from the Winnipeg lab, because the woman that was escorted off the premises by the RCMP, right? She apparently was making 4 trips a year to Wuhan City, and it is alleged she was carrying or transporting or transferring pathogens.
I'm glad you brought her up, David. I wanted to share this with you. In addition to advertising booze, the Globe and Mail just this morning tells us that the whereabouts of these 2 scientists from the Winnipeg virus lab who are, being apprehended for possible national security issues, their whereabouts are shrouded in mystery and ads. But they don't know where Dr. Chu is.
Well, I would say there's another individual whose whereabouts are shrouded, or activities are shrouded in mystery, and I think that's Christopher Charles Ingveldsson, who is practiced at pimping hardcore adult and child pornography in 60 countries, I presume, because I don't see how he could run an international pedophile ring during the period when Starnet is doing exactly what I've just said, right? And the technology that was confiscated from Starnet, I believe, was shared with or incorporated or adopted by BBC Studios around the world. After all, BBC Studios is producing documentaries. This year, they will be producing and funding 911, the 20th anniversary, right? So since we know that the production capability of the technology confiscated from Starnet could do exactly that and show levels of gratuitous cruelty that most people, their flesh would creep.
Can't even
like
conceive of it.
Well, the murder of the Shermans, if they basically just wanted to eliminate them, a couple of bullets would do.
Exactly.
But you see the Shermans, well, I don't need to go into the details, but I can guarantee you, Jason, that there will be people buried allegedly in COVID graves in the vicinity of Wuhan City, monitored by Maxar. When and if they do an autopsy on those people, you will find that some of them were probably put on a ventilator and suffocated, right? And then if you investigated the ventilator, you could find that could be controlled remotely like a Dominion voting machine, right? So they have the method by hacking into these networks I think the Chinese, that article about the use of extortion to get cooperation in sequential gameplay, it has the word that the authors, who look like they work with the Second Bureau of the People's Liberation Army, believe that that technique can be applied to heterogeneous networks. Well, isn't the BBC Studios, which is being upgraded by Bovis, right? Wouldn't that be an extraordinary, probably one of the world's most powerful heterogeneous networks for the generation of propaganda, news, and entertainment? Right? So we've got this extraordinary possibility.
Sorry, real quick, David. We're almost out of time before we transition. We still have some, but I want to make sure that people know they're going to be able to join us for an even more in-depth conversation about all of this in just about 15 minutes on subscribestar.com/reversecsi, patreon.com/reversecsi. You know, I'm sorry, I have your old graphic up there, David. They're both now reverse CSI that people can sponsor you on. And they're also going to be able to see the show on Patreon and Subscribestar/crowdsource the truth. There's a couple of other technical things I want to let people know about, David, because, you know, we did a show yesterday with Larry Klayman and Dr. Judy Mikovits. It's already been removed from YouTube. Quite upsetting. But the good news is that people can watch Crowdsource the Truth live streams on Rumble now. Some of your countrymen, David, have created this kind of open source video streaming platform, and Crowdsource the Truth is now on Rumble at CS the Truth, so people can watch this live. We've got 21 people watching us on Rumble right now. Welcome to everybody on Rumble. You can also catch my trip to Diddle Island this morning, Barry Diller's weird sort of park over there. And yesterday's Citizens Grand Jury session is still online on Rumble. People can hear the testimony from Dr. Judy Mikovits, where finally the things that she's been saying for about 10 years, David, are being corroborated in the mainstream news. It seems strange. I kind of don't trust it. It's almost like finding $1,000 cash on your front stoop when you come home. What is that doing there? And it just seems unusual.
Yeah, well, I can't answer that, but, you know, in the limited time left, I just want to emphasize the role allegedly played by the BBC and the pimps associated with the Trudeau family that go back at least to the time of Jimmy Savile in the 1950s, and these two companies, Maxar and Maximus. And Maximus is particularly important because I believe Maximus, for example, extorts about 40,000 families in BC with a population of 4 million, right? And probably very similar in the United States, where it's operating the Deadbeat Parents Punishment Act that was introduced under Bill Clinton. And what Maximus, I believe, can do, can do background checks on everyone that is caught up in this family maintenance enforcement program or the deadbeat parents, and find out which families are vulnerable to extortion. And just give you an example of extortion back in 1970, the Office of Economic Opportunity introduced a sterilization program in the United States where, for example, a poor black woman was told, you will be denied your welfare benefits unless you have your daughters sterilized. Maybe Americans haven't woken up to the fact that that is a eugenics program, essentially, that has infiltrated inside the government of the United States by probably people out of the United Kingdom. Right? So now, fast forward, 1975, Maximus was established. In 1999 or 98, it had an IPO, a bit like Serco, where those big ETF shareholders came in, right? Vanguard, BlackRock, and State Street. And Vanguard, BlackRock, and State Street have about 20% of the voting equity of Maximus and Maxar. So they control, I believe, the crime scenes where the body bits that should otherwise be autopsied to find out how they died have either been scrambled or buried or whatever, and then that crime scene is protected by real-time surveillance through Maxar satellites. So there will be mass graves outside Wuhan City and in Iran and in Brazil, etc., being surveilled by Maxar to make sure that no one gets inside those graves and does a proper autopsy as to how they died. And I think when they do that for these alleged victims of COVID-19, they will find many of them, right, did not die from COVID-19, but that was put on the death certificate. And then those figures are uploaded by Maxar into Johns Hopkins University, transmitted into BBC, and the BBC produces a daily body count, which is essentially the pimping of a parallel narrative. I'm not saying there isn't a virus. What I am saying is what is being presented to the public is the BBC's interpretation of what the public needs to understand from this virus to condition their behavior. Over to you.
I've just, somebody reminded me that this got projected on the broadcasting house just the other day, David, the British Brainwashing Corporation. If I were involved, I would have created some sort of a slideshow that could have gone through the various acronyms. The British Brainwashing Corporation is busy buggering children, and I'm sure there's an endless list of humorous little nicknames that we can give to the BBC. But what is not humorous is this history of covering up the acts of Jimmy Savile. I mean, it's clear now, even if they didn't know, it's been revealed. And there hasn't been some kind of, giant expose of Jimmy Savile talking about what he did and how terrible it was. If anything, it's still being covered up. And of course, we've spoken endlessly about this incredibly weird statue that certainly somebody who was appalled by pedophilia would very likely be appalled by this and certainly remove it. They've repeatedly refused to do it. We've seen articles about CSIS scrubbing certain things out of files for Pierre Trudeau. We've made the comment about how remarkably, it looks like mascara on Justin Trudeau in this picture. And he's hanging out with his buddy, Christopher Charles Ingvaldson, who we can barely find on the internet. And I also forgot to tell you, there was that author, I think his name is Sam Cooper, who wrote the book about Cameron Ortis. I contacted him, and I haven't heard back from him yet, but we almost forgot to check what is happening with Cameron Ortis. And I also forgot to mention to our viewers that there is yet another way that people can watch and enjoy the simulcast live streams, David. I have created a David Hawkins YouTube channel. It's the Reverse CSI YouTube channel. We've got 14 people watching us on the live stream right now. Thank you for that, everybody. But people can go over and subscribe to the David Hawkins Reverse CSI channel. I've been attempting to restore, David, our legacy videos. So people who maybe just found us recently and haven't seen some of these can go back and take a look. So many of the Crowdsource the Truth internet properties have been, banned, deleted, removed for a variety of different reasons. And there's so much information here that I still want people to be able to see, so they can now join us on the David Hawkins Reverse CSI YouTube channel for live stream simulcasts, for the Legacy Library. And of course, we want to remind people that they can visit your website, David, your free website, which is Reverse CSI Scripts. And that has a lot of information about your work. It's got a YouTube playlist that contains the links to the past videos, and it's a great way for people to keep up with everything that we're doing. We're going to be back in just about 5 minutes here. People can watch the sponsor-exclusive segment of today's show on subscribestar.com/reversecsi, patreon.com/reversecsi. I don't know what this old graphic is doing in there, but we can also see those sponsor-exclusive shows on Patreon and Subscribestar/Crowdsource the Truth. Please join us over there. We can't do this show without your support and sponsorship. Everybody now sees what happens when we all want free video content from YouTube. It's not actually free, Advertisers are paying for that content, and if those people decide that they don't like the videos, you can't see them at all. So please join us on Patreon and Subscribestar. David, I'll see you in just a few minutes. We've got a lot more to discuss.